Keep it simple, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his voice just loud enough for the entire table to hear. It's usually all some people can manage. The laughter came easily, too easily, echoing off crystal chandeliers and polished marble as if rehearsed, as if expected. And in the middle of it all, Emily Carter stood still, a tray balanced lightly in her hands, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, as though the sound had passed through her without leaving a mark. Daniel Whitmore didn't look at her again right away, not because he had forgotten her, but because to him, she had already served her purpose, a moment of amusement, a passing note in an otherwise perfect evening, his custom-tailored suit catching the warm light, his Swiss watch glinting with every careless gesture, a man entirely at home in a room designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Around him, his guests, investors, partners, people who measured their lives in millions and minutes, smiled politely, some genuinely entertained, others watching more carefully, sensing something just beneath the surface, something not yet spoken. Emily moved then. Not hurried, not flustered, but precise, placing a glass of water beside a guest without a sound, her fingers steady, her gaze lowered just enough to remain professional, but not submissive, never submissive. She had worked rooms like this before, had learned the rhythm of wealth, the subtle choreography of power, the way laughter could shift from warm to sharp in a single breath. And she had learned something else too, that silence, when held long enough, could become louder than any voice. Daniel leaned back in his chair, satisfied, tapping his fingers lightly against the table as he turned to the man beside him, continuing a conversation about acquisitions and projections, numbers that stretched into the hundreds of millions as casually as if they were discussing the weather. Yet every so often, his eyes flicked back toward her, curious in a way he wouldn't admit, as if expecting a reaction that never came. She didn't rush, didn't shrink, didn't even pretend not to hear, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. In a way he couldn't quite name. Across the room, a server paused, watching, sensing the tension threading quietly through the air, while the low hum of conversation carried on, unaware that something was beginning to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Emily stopped at the edge of the table once more, the faint clink of glass against polished wood marking her presence, and for a brief second, her eyes lifted, not defiant, not challenging, but clear, steady, as if she saw the room exactly as it was, without the illusion of status or spectacle. Daniel noticed it then. That look, and something in his smile faltered, just slightly, just enough to be real, before he leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table, his voice returning, sharper this time, more deliberate. "Tell me," he said, turning fully toward her now, the attention of the table shifting with him. "What does simplicity teach us?" The question hung there, polished and precise, designed to corner, to entertain, to remind everyone exactly who controlled the narrative. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because even those who had laughed before could feel it now, the subtle tightening of the air, the quiet before something changed. And Emily did not answer, not immediately, her silence stretching just long enough to make the room aware of itself, aware of the weight of expectation pressing in from every side, until even Daniel's confidence had to wait, just for a second longer than he intended. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a room adjusting to a change in temperature that no one could quite explain, and Daniel felt it before he understood it. The way the laughter from moments ago no longer echoed. The way every pair of eyes seemed to settle not on him, but on her, waiting, measuring, and Emily let that silence exist just a fraction longer. Her fingers relaxed against the edge of the tray, her breathing steady, as if time itself had slowed to match her pace. Then she spoke, her voice calm, low, not raised to command attention, yet somehow reaching every corner of the room. "Simplicity," she said, pausing just enough to let the word stand on its own, "teaches people what remains when everything unnecessary is taken away." And for a second, it sounded like an answer anyone could give, safe, almost agreeable, until she lifted her eyes fully to meet Daniel's, not challenging, not apologizing, simply present. It shows who someone is when they can no longer rely on what they have. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate, subtle shifts in posture. A guest lowering his glass mid-sip, another glancing sideways as if to confirm they had heard correctly, because something in the tone, something in the precision of her phrasing, carried a weight that did not belong to a casual reply, and Daniel's expression held, his practiced composure still in place, but his fingers stopped tapping, just for a moment, just long enough to betray the smallest interruption in his control. He leaned back slightly, studying her now, really studying her, as if seeing her for the first time not as background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. That sounds rehearsed, he said, a faint smile returning, though it did not quite reach his eyes. Do you always give philosophical answers when someone asks a simple question? A few guests shifted again, uncertain whether to laugh this time, uncertain whether the moment was still his to control, and Emily did not rush to respond. She turned slightly, placing a folded napkin beside a guest with the same quiet precision as before, her movements unhurried, grounded, as if the conversation existed on her terms now, not his, and when she spoke again, she did not look away. No, sir, she said, her tone unchanged. Only when the question is not really simple. The words did not rise, did not push, they settled. And in that settling, something changed again, more noticeable now, a tension that did not belong to discomfort, but to recognition, the kind that made people sit a little straighter without knowing why. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a small sound, almost a laugh, but not quite, and he reached for his glass, lifting it, then setting it back down without taking a sip, his gaze still fixed on her, because now there was curiosity there, sharp and deliberate, layered, beneath something else he had not felt in a long time, not in rooms like this, not among people who measured themselves against him and always came up short. Across the table, one of the guests leaned forward slightly, watching Daniel instead of Emily now, as if waiting to see how he would respond, as if the balance had tilted just enough to make the outcome uncertain, and Emily remained exactly where she was, not retreating, not advancing, simply present in the space she occupied, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore did not immediately have the next line ready. Daniel did not speak right away, and that alone was enough to draw the room deeper into the moment, because men like him were not known for hesitation, not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, and certainly not at their own table. Yet here he was, leaning back slightly, his eyes fixed on Emily, as if recalculating something that no longer added up the way it should, and for the first time that evening, the weight of attention shifted fully away from his guests and settled between the two of them. Quiet, steady, undeniable. One of the investors cleared his throat softly, a reflex more than a decision, while another adjusted his cufflinks, eyes flicking between Daniel and the woman standing calmly beside the table, as if witnessing a conversation that had moved beyond polite dinner talk into something far more precise. Daniel finally reached for his glass again, lifting it halfway before pausing, his reflection catching faintly in the surface of the amber liquid, and when he spoke, his tone had changed, not softer, not kinder, but more focused, stripped of the casual amusement that had filled it earlier. You are careful with your words, he said, watching her closely. That usually means there is more behind them than you are saying. It was not a question, not exactly, but it carried one beneath it, an invitation disguised as observation. Emily did not look surprised, nor did she look pleased. She simply listened, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that made the room feel slightly smaller around her, and when she responded, she did not rush, did not fill the space unnecessarily. Sometimes, she said, her voice even, people say more than they intend without realizing it. The sentence settled differently than the others, not sharp, not direct, but precise enough to land where it needed to, and Daniel understood that immediately, not because it was obvious, but because it was accurate, and accuracy had always been something he respected, even when it worked against him. A faint shift moved through the table, subtle, but unmistakable, as if the invisible line that separated host and observer had blurred, and now no one was entirely sure who was leading the exchange anymore. Daniel leaned forward slightly this time, resting his forearms on the table, his attention no longer divided, no longer casual. "And what do you think I intended?" he asked, the question deliberate now, stripped of performance. And for a moment, the room held its breath again, because this was no longer a game meant for entertainment. It was something else entirely, something closer to exposure. Emily glanced briefly at the table, at the untouched glasses, the polished surfaces, the small details that spoke of careful presentation, then back at him, her expression steady, almost thoughtful. "I think," she said, choosing each word with quiet precision, "you intended to make a point without having to explain it." There was no accusation in her tone, no edge, just clarity, and that clarity did more than any challenge could have, because it removed the distance he had relied on, the comfortable layer of assumption that allowed him to speak without consequence. Daniel held her gaze, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered there, not anger, not embarrassment, but recognition, the kind that came when someone articulated a truth you had not expected to hear out loud. And around them, the room remained still, not out of obligation, but because no one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding, the quiet shift of control, the slow unraveling of certainty. And Emily stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, not elevated, not diminished, simply unchanged, which, in a room built on constant positioning, was perhaps the most powerful stance of all. The recognition did not fade quickly. It lingered in Daniel's expression, subtle but undeniable, like a thought he had not planned to have. And for a moment he simply watched her, as if deciding whether to dismiss what she had said or to follow it further. And the room waited with him, the quiet stretching not with tension this time, but with attention, the kind that comes when something real begins to surface beneath the surface. He leaned back again, slower now, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, no longer tapping, no longer performing. "And what if I did?" he said, his voice measured. "What if I intended exactly that?" There was a faint challenge in it, but it felt different now, less about control, more about testing the ground beneath his own words. And Emily did not hesitate, not because she was eager to respond, but because she did not need time to decide. "Then it worked," she said simply, and the answer seemed almost too straightforward until she added, her tone unchanged. Everyone heard it. A few heads turned slightly at that, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge the truth in it, the way a single sentence, spoken casually, could shape the entire room without anyone questioning it in the moment. Daniel's jaw shifted, just slightly, and he let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but there was no amusement in it now, only a growing awareness that the conversation had moved beyond where he had intended to keep it. "You are not wrong," he admitted, the words coming slower than before, as if he were choosing them more carefully than he was used to, and that alone caused a subtle shift among the guests, a glance here, a raised brow there, because agreement was not something they often heard from him, not without negotiation attached to it. Emily inclined her head just slightly, not in submission, not in victory, simply acknowledging the moment for what it was, and then she reached forward, placing a small folded check presenter on the table, the soft contact barely audible, yet somehow marking a transition more clearly than anything that had been said, and Daniel's eyes dropped to it. Instinctively, noticing the precision with which it was aligned, the small detail of order in a room that had just experienced something far less structured. He rested his hand on the table beside it, but did not open it, his attention returning to her instead. "You speak as if you have seen this before," he said, quieter now, and the question carried less edge, more curiosity, as if he were no longer testing her, but trying to understand her. And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, thoughtful. "I have seen people rely on what they have," she said, "and I have seen what happens when that is no longer enough." There was no elaboration, no explanation offered, just the statement itself, and it landed with a weight that did not require context to be felt. The room remained still, not frozen, but attentive in a way that felt almost unfamiliar in a setting like this, where conversations usually overlapped, competed, filled every available space. Yet now there was restraint, a collective decision, unspoken, to let this exchange continue without interruption. Daniel glanced briefly at his guests, noticing their silence, their focus, and something shifted again, not in the room this time, but in him, a subtle realization that the dynamic he had shaped so easily at the beginning of the evening no longer belonged entirely to him. And when he looked back at Emily, there was no trace of dismissal left, only a measured respect forming quietly beneath the surface, unannounced, but unmistakable. Daniel's gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he finally looked down at the check presenter, his fingers brushing its edge but still not opening it, as if the simple act of ending the interaction now carried more weight than it should have. And around him, his guests remained unusually quiet. Their earlier confidence softened into something more observant, more measured, because they had all felt it. The subtle shift that had taken place without announcement, without force. He exhaled, slowly, leaning back once more, but this time the movement felt different, less like a man reclaiming space, and more like someone reconsidering it. You speak from experience, he said, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a statement that had already found its answer. And Emily did not deny it, did not confirm it directly either. She simply met his gaze with the same steady calm that had defined her from the beginning. Most people do, she replied, her tone quiet, almost reflective. They just do not always realize it until something changes. The words settled gently, but their meaning extended further than the moment, and Daniel understood that, too. Not in full detail, not yet, but enough to recognize that whatever shaped her perspective had not come from theory or observation alone. He tapped the check lightly with his finger, once, then slid it a few inches closer to himself, finally opening it, his eyes scanning the total without really seeing it, because his attention remained divided, caught between the numbers in front of him and the presence still standing beside the table, composed, unshaken, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. One of the guests shifted in his seat, clearing his throat softly before attempting to steer the conversation back towards safer ground, mentioning a deal, a timeline, something familiar. But the words felt thinner now, less certain, and even Daniel did not immediately respond, his focus returning to Emily, as if the rest of the room had momentarily lost its relevance. "You have been here long?" he asked, and the question, simple on the surface, carried a different kind of curiosity beneath it, one that had nothing to do with service or routine, and Emily considered it for a brief moment before answering. "Long enough," she said, her voice even, "to understand how quickly things can look permanent until they are not." And again, the room felt that shift, subtle but present, the way her words seemed to reach beyond the table, beyond the moment, touching something more universal, something that did not depend on titles or wealth to be understood. Daniel closed the check. Presenter without comment, setting it aside, his posture no longer rigid, no longer performative, and for the first time that evening, there was no need for him to assert control, no impulse to reclaim the tone he had set at the beginning, because the dynamic had already changed, quietly, completely. He nodded once, not to dismiss her, not to end the exchange, but to acknowledge it, and in that small gesture, there was something unfamiliar, something honest, a recognition that did not need to be spoken aloud. Emily returned the nod just as simply, then stepped back, her movements as composed as ever, the tray still balanced in her hand, the same as before, yet somehow not the same at all, because now, the room watched her differently, not as background, not as function, but as presence, and as she turned to move toward another table, the silence she left behind did not feel empty. It felt full, as if something had been understood without needing to be explained. The low hum of conversation slowly returned, but it no longer carried the same tone. It was softer now, more restrained, as if the room itself had learned something it could not quite articulate. And Daniel sat there for a moment longer, his attention drifting not to his guests, not to his phone, but to the space Emily had just left behind, as though the absence itself held meaning. He picked up his glass again, this time actually taking a sip, but even that small action felt different, less automatic, more deliberate. And when he set it down, his eyes followed her across the room, watching the way she moved from table to table with the same quiet precision, the same unshaken composure, as if nothing about the last few minutes had altered her rhythm at all. One of the guests leaned closer, lowering his voice slightly. "Interesting staff you have here," he said, the words carefully neutral, but the implication clear, and Daniel gave a small nod, his gaze still tracking her. Yes. He replied simply, and that single word carried more acknowledgement than anything he had said earlier in the evening. Another guest attempted to resume a discussion about projections, mentioning figures, timelines, percentages, but the conversation struggled to regain its previous momentum, each sentence feeling just slightly disconnected, as if the room had shifted focus to something less tangible, something that could not be measured or negotiated. Daniel finally looked back at the table, glancing at the untouched plates, the carefully arranged setting, and then at the check he had closed moments ago, his fingers resting lightly on it again, but he did not open it this time, did not need to, because whatever transaction had taken place was no longer about numbers. Across the room, Emily paused briefly at another table, listening, responding with the same calm professionalism, her voice too low to carry, yet her presence somehow more noticeable than before, and Daniel found himself studying the details he would have overlooked earlier, the steadiness of her posture, the clarity in her movements, the absence of any need to prove something to anyone. He leaned back again, this time without tension, without performance, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to simply observe, not evaluate, not control, just observe. And that in itself was unfamiliar. "You seem distracted," one of the investors noted quietly, and Daniel turned his head slightly, offering a faint smile that did not quite return to its usual confidence. "Just thinking," he replied, and the answer, though simple, was enough to end the question, because thinking, real thinking, was something they all understood, even if they did not often see it happen like this. His gaze returned to Emily once more, and this time there was no trace of dismissal, no calculation of status or role, only a quiet curiosity, and perhaps something closer to respect, forming gradually, without announcement, without intention. The room continued around them, conversations resuming in fragments, glasses being lifted, cutlery moving softly against porcelain. But the center of gravity had changed, subtly, permanently, and Daniel knew it, not because anyone said it out loud, but because for the first time that evening, he was not the one defining the tone of the room, and he did not feel the need to take it back. The evening continued, but not in the way it had begun, because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, and even as conversations resumed and deals were mentioned again, they no longer carried the same certainty, the same effortless dominance that had filled the room before, and Daniel could feel it, not as a loss, but as a recalibration, a quiet awareness settling in where confidence had once operated without question. He reached for his phone out of habit, glancing at the screen, but the notifications, the messages, the constant stream of urgency that usually demanded his attention felt distant now, almost irrelevant, and after a brief moment, he set it face down on the table, an action so small, yet so uncharacteristic, that one of the guests noticed but said nothing. Across the room, Emily continued her work, her movement steady, unhurried, as if she had not altered the rhythm of the entire space just minutes ago, and that, more than anything, held his attention, because she had not claimed anything, had not asserted herself in a way that demanded recognition, and yet recognition had come anyway. One of the investors leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with a thoughtful expression. "You did not respond the way you usually do," he said quietly, not accusing, not critical, just observant, and Daniel allowed a faint smile to return, though it carried a different weight now, less performative, more reflective. "Maybe I heard something worth listening to," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer settled over the table in a way no elaborate explanation could have, because it was both unexpected and undeniable. A few of the guests exchanged glances, subtle acknowledgments passing between them, the kind that required no words, because they had all witnessed the same moment, the same shift, and each of them understood it in their own way, even if they would never speak of it directly. Daniel's gaze moved once more across the room, finding Emily again, and this time there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to frame her within the context he was used to, only a quiet recognition of her presence as something complete on its own, something that did not need to be measured against anything else. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, and for a brief second, the room seemed to narrow again, not because of tension, but because of clarity, the kind that comes when something finally aligns without force. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm, directed not at his guests but at the moment itself, and he stood, the movement smooth, unhurried, drawing just enough attention to be noticed without becoming a spectacle. And as he stepped away from the table, a subtle silence followed, not commanded, not expected, but natural, as if the room itself understood that something unfinished was about to be addressed. Emily was at the far side now, placing a glass of water down for another guest, her posture unchanged, her focus steady, and when she turned, she saw him approaching, not with urgency, not with authority, but with intention, and for a moment, the distance between them held everything that had not yet been said, everything that no longer needed to be hidden behind tone or status, just two people meeting again, not as roles, but as something more direct, something far less easy to define. Emily did not step back when he approached, nor did she step forward. She simply remained where she was, her posture composed, her attention steady, as if she had already accepted whatever this moment might bring without needing to prepare for it. And Daniel stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, yet far enough to respect the space she had never surrendered, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them not empty, but intentional, as if both understood that what came next did not need to be rushed. He glanced briefly at the table she had just served, acknowledging the guest with a small nod before returning his focus to her, and when he finally spoke, his tone carried none of the sharpness from earlier, none of the casual dominance that had once defined it. "I meant what I said before," he began, then paused, not out of uncertainty, but to choose the words more carefully than he was used to. "About people relying on what they have." His gaze held steady, searching not for weakness, but for clarity, and Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that did not invite apology, nor demand it. He continued, slower now. "I have spent most of my life building things that cannot be taken away," he said, almost to himself as much as to her. "Or at least, that is what I believed." And there was a quiet honesty in the admission, one that did not ask for agreement, only acknowledgement, and Emily gave it with the slightest inclination of her head, not affirming his belief, but recognizing the truth within it. "But you are right," he added after a moment, the words landing with a weight that did not need emphasis. "When something changes, what remains matters more." The sentence settled between them, simple, direct, and for the first time, entirely free of performance. Emily's eyes softened, not with emotion that needed to be displayed, but with understanding that did not require explanation. "Most people do not realize that until it happens," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same calm certainty that had guided every word she had spoken that evening. "And by then, it feels like something was taken, even if it was never truly theirs to begin with." And Daniel absorbed that, not reacting immediately, not deflecting, just letting it exist, because this time, there was no need to respond quickly, no need to control the direction of the conversation. A few feet away, the low murmur of the restaurant continued, distant now, as if the space around them had narrowed again, not with tension, but with focus, and Daniel nodded once, a small, genuine acknowledgement that carried more weight than any elaborate statement could have. "You see things clearly," he said, not as a compliment, but as a recognition, and Emily gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, one that did not linger, one that did not seek to be noticed. "I see what is in front of me," she replied, and the simplicity of that answer held more depth than anything else that had been said, because it did not elevate her, did not diminish him, it simply existed as truth. Daniel glanced back toward his table, where his guests now watched with quiet interest, no longer pretending not to notice, and when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation left, only clarity. "Thank you," he said, the words straightforward, unadorned, and for a moment, they seemed almost out of place in a setting built on negotiation and advantage. Yet here, they fit perfectly, because they were not transactional, they were real. Emily nodded once in return, accepting the words without surprise, without reaction beyond what was necessary, and as Daniel turned to walk back toward his table, the space between them remained unchanged in distance, but entirely transformed in meaning. Because what had begun as a moment of control had ended in something far quieter, far more lasting, a shift that no one in the room could fully explain, but none of them would forget. When Daniel returned to the table, no one spoke immediately, not because they were unsure of what to say, but because they understood that whatever had just happened did not belong to casual conversation, and he took his seat with the same measured calm he had shown when he stood, yet everything about him felt quieter now, more deliberate, as if the space he occupied had been adjusted from within rather than imposed from the outside. He reached for the check once more, opening it without hesitation this time, and without looking at the total for long. He placed his card inside, sliding it toward the edge of the table with a simple, unremarkable motion, yet one that carried a finality beyond the transaction itself. One of the guests leaned forward slightly, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "That was unexpected," he said, not as criticism, but as acknowledgement, and Daniel gave a small nod, his gaze briefly drifting across the room before returning. "Not everything worth hearing is expected," he replied, and the words settled into the conversation with a quiet certainty that no one felt the need to challenge. The group exchanged subtle glances, not questioning, not dismissing, but recognizing that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone by returning to numbers and projections. And for the first time that evening, no one rushed to fill the silence with business. Across the room, Emily continued her work, clearing a table, aligning silverware with the same precise care, her movements unchanged, her presence steady, as if the moment that had altered the room existed only as a quiet ripple, not something she needed to carry forward. And yet, every so often, a guest would glance in her direction, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, as if they had all been made aware of something they had previously overlooked. The server returned to collect the check, and Daniel handed it over with a brief nod, his attention already shifting elsewhere, not to his phone, not to his guests, but to the larger awareness settling in, the kind that did not demand immediate action, only understanding. "Shall we continue?" one of the investors asked cautiously, and Daniel looked at him, then at the rest of the table, considering the question in a way he might not have before, and after a moment, he gave a faint, almost thoughtful smile. "We will," he said, but perhaps with a little more clarity than we started with. And no one questioned what he meant, because they all felt it in their own way, the subtle recalibration of perspective that had taken place without announcement. The conversation resumed, slower, more measured, the tone no longer driven by dominance, but by consideration, and even as figures were mentioned again, they carried less weight than they had before, because something else now existed alongside them, something that could not be calculated or owned. Near the end of the evening, as coats were gathered and quiet goodbyes exchanged, Daniel stood once more, his gaze naturally finding Emily across the room, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, no longer as strangers defined by roles, but as two people who had shared a moment that required no explanation, and he gave a small nod, simple, genuine, and she returned it just as quietly, without ceremony, without expectation, as he walked toward the exit, the soft glow of the restaurant lights fading behind him. There was no sense of something gained or lost, only a quiet understanding that something had been revealed, something that would not fade with the evening, because it had not been spoken loudly, had not demanded attention. It had simply existed, steady and undeniable, and as the door closed behind him, the room returned to its rhythm, yet not quite the same as before, carrying with it a lesson